All right, I think we've got a good crowd here, so we may as well get things started. I'd like to, first of all, introduce our panelists. We'll start off with Andrew Smith. Andrew is marketing and e-commerce professional with over 2 decades of experience in digital. His expert knowledge of e-commerce, especially on Shopify, as well as online travel marketing and all areas of search engine optimization and content strategy. Linda Ferguson brings a wealth of technical SEO to Intrepid. She's been in the space for over 20 years. Along her many marquee engagements in the field, she includes a nearly 2-year stint as a search engine quality consultant for Google, which many of you have probably heard of. In Q4 of last year, Linda was responsible for identifying a major flaw in the Shopify hydrogen system, which, had she not identified it, would have probably led to all pages on that platform effectively being invisible to Google. And last but certainly not least, we have Sikora. She's been an SEO professional for over a dozen years and has run SEO programs for international brands, including Expedia, Hotels.com, Avis, and NewLook.com. Most recently, she came to Intrepid after 4 years of running SEO strategy of the Emirates Group, consisting of 6 B2C brands across 54 markets. And I am your host, Todd Hirschberg. I've been in the SEO field for about 30 years. I started off writing algorithms for one of the first search engines. And over the years, I've been involved everything from Alta Vista beta tester to working for in-house and agency clients around the world. Let's dive right into the Q&A session, shall we? I guess let's start with Andrew. So Andrew, what are some of the more common pitfalls you see with the Shopify platform?
Sure, and thanks for the really nice intro there, Todd. So I'd say one of the ones that I see come up time and time again, and I actually saw that this week, is where Shopify has these kind of like My Shopify subdomains. So every single site is essentially, when you set up your domain, that domain is pointing to a Shopify subdomain. And quite often what we see happen is developers will sort of inadvertently build stuff on the platform, which essentially references those Shopify subdomains. The one where this becomes kind of a major problem is where you end up with canonical tags that are pointing to these My Shopify subdomains. And this I have seen come up probably half a dozen times and will cause kind of major headaches for Google. So it's definitely one to seriously watch out for. And then I would say one of the kind of other, Linda will probably speak to this a little bit too, but one of the other ones that we commonly see is just kind of like misuse of things like lazy loading and not being kind of implemented particularly well. So anything kind of above the folds, we've seen it, fairly frequently, where we see like things that essentially should be like eager loaded being lazy loaded, which basically slows down things for core web vitals. But in general, I would say those are kind of 2 that stick out for me. I don't know if maybe Mags or Linda might want to chip in on anything else they see regularly.
Yeah. Linda, any additional comments?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Andrew said about the canonicals and the My Shopify issue. We've also seen that in sitemaps. So, that can get ported over to sitemaps, can be real problematic. Sitemaps are not easy to kind of deal with in Shopify out of the box. So another thing to look out for when you're implementing. Yeah.
Yep. Mags, anything further?
Yeah, I would add something completely different. Actually, the fact that all the images sits on the CDN, on the subdomain of Shopify. And because of that, there is no possibility to get links to the domain through the images. And this is really great tactic, very popular in the past and still very much used. But because of those images sits within the Shopify domain, obviously those links are impossible to get. Right. Yeah, I would say that.
Excellent, thank you. Linda, from an SEO perspective, what are some of the more technical challenges you're seeing with Shopify?
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. So I would say one of them is the constraints that Shopify has on URL slug. So you're really limited to a certain set of slugs. So URL slug, for those that are not familiar, it's part of the URL, like slash, subfolder, name of subfolder, whatever. And Shopify has products and collections, pages, and blogs. And so you're really constrained by that. Plus, out of the box, you have to do some configuration with those because it will add some extraneous slugs in there. And so you might have to, rewrite Liquid to, make sure that you have the most optimal that you can have within the Shopify construct. Another one I would say that I've seen pretty often, and this can happen on just about every site that, regardless of platform, but it's something that we do see quite often in Shopify setups are soft 404s. And those are URLs that are actually, they should be returning a 404 code, but they're returning a 200 status code, meaning that Google sees these pages as actually being pages, but there's no content there. That can lead to Google looking at the site. If there are a lot of these on a site, Google can start looking at a site as lower quality. So that's definitely something to keep your eye out for and mitigate as soon as possible when you see that issue. You're on mute, Todd.
Mags, any technical things that you're seeing?
I would say probably product tagging. Yes, what we see quite a lot is that the e-commerce owners, they create lots of those tags for the products. Those tags are not editable. They created quite a lot of thin content. And it's actually connected with what Linda already said. Those 200 pages, which actually should return false in many cases. These are pages which actually don't add value and create some kind of a duplication, which we probably will be talking about slightly later on. And I would also kudos those lack of editable XML sitemaps, which is really difficult from SEO point of view.
Thank you. Andrew, anything further to add?
No, I don't think there's anything else to add beyond what Mags and Linda have covered.
Okay, super. Mags, what are some of the most critical settings that, as people are unboxing, from the get-go, they should make sure that are set up correctly?
Okay, so from the very basic setup, like setting up the primary domain and actually making sure that there is enabled redirection, it means that if primary domain is set up, then the Google and enable that redirection is enabled, Google will not see the primary domain and Shopify own managed domain as the form of duplication. And this is very often kind of missed across clients or sites we've seen. I would also say that making sure that the product links which are featured on the collection pages points to a canonical version of the URLs. This is not the default setup of Shopify, and this is very often missed. And again, I would refer back to the tags and duplications. Make sure that you create tag strategy, and less is better in this case. So those three things I would definitely keep in mind when you set up the new site on Shopify.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, something that kind of springs to mind, I touched on this already with the My Shopify subdomain, but there's another area where this also becomes problematic. So if you have, if you're using hreflang, so basically if you have international sites on separate top level domains, you'll see the same issue that you may see in sitemaps, you may see in canonicals, but you'll also see that spring up in hreflang as well. And if you're running those international sites, getting hreflang right can be absolutely crucial to making sure that you don't end up with the wrong domain ranking in different markets. So particularly if you've got like one domain that is considerably stronger than another domain, making sure that you get that set up correctly is critical. And it does relate to what Mags was saying about that, you know, getting the domain correctly configured. But just I would really just say watch out for that, because I really do see this happening a lot. I've seen this across multiple sites, and it just seems to be one of those kind of bugs that is recurrent, and you will see spring up kind of time and time again. So keep an eye out for that.
Excellent, thank you. Linda, anything further?
Just to add kind of on the topic of international SEO. So I guess it's important to be aware that for international payments, you're a bit constrained. I think as at last check, there were only several countries, international countries, that accepted Shopify Pay, the payments that are default on Shopify. So something to be aware of, you know, just to when you're reviewing what the different platforms are that might be suitable for your particular site or sites, that's something to consider as well, just to be aware of.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Let's see. Andrew, with collection pages, what do you think the optimal way to, you know, really boost those and get visibility to them?
Okay, so I think there's probably a couple of things to consider here. One, I would say make sure that you've got enough products that are actually on those collections. You know, you quite often see that collections can end up being quite thin if there's only a handful of products. So one way to certainly try and bulk those out a bit is, first of all, I would say kind of just make sure that you're not dividing your products into collections that don't necessarily make sense. Try to ensure that they've got enough products on them. Like, and by enough, I mean probably really a minimum of like 5 products. I think if you've only got one product on a collections page, then you really should question whether or not that collection should exist. And then something that I don't think e-commerce sites are really taking advantage of enough is FAQ schema. So this is a pretty easy way for you to boost your click-through rate on collections. So if you're not familiar with it already, it's a kind of type of featured snippet that will appear in search results. So let's say you put 5 frequently asked questions about a particular collection on your page. If you mark that up with FAQ schema, Google is likely to display those FAQs in search results. And one easy way of really sort of identifying what those FAQs should be is just to search around your collection. So let's say, for instance, you sell running shoes and you've got a collection about running shoes. Just search for that and look at what Google's people also asked questions are that pop up. And by taking those questions, you end up developing some really kind of nice content that will complement what you've got on the pages. But those are obviously questions that users are already asking, so it's relevant for your topic, for your collection, and then you can really work on coming up with some nice succinct answers to those and including those on the page. This is an easy way to add unique kind of relevant content, but then also to boost that page in terms of increasing click-through rate and increasing search result real estate. So I think that's an easy win. Anybody can apply this to any of your collection pages.
Linda, anything further to add?
I guess I would say, you know, just being, it's probably a good idea to create a robust taxonomy before you even start coding, right? I mean, so I've seen sites that just kind of throw together collections and, you know, they don't make sense and they're not really optimized. So, you know, just, I think Andrew might have touched on this, but like to start from, you know, before you even start coding, think about your taxonomy. And it's a living, breathing thing, right? It can always shift as products shift, but always keep an eye on it and make sure that they're optimized at all times. You can always change things. But another thing that we also recommend is that if you do change a collection, it's best not to change the URL if you can help it. That can cause major issues for Google. We've actually seen that quite recently on a site. So it's just a good piece of advice. Don't change a URL unless it's absolutely necessary. It's not really necessarily a collection specific issue, but it just happens to be that we saw that on a collections page this week. So anyway.
Excellent, thanks. Mags, anything additionally?
Yeah, I would probably add, make sure you properly interlink the collections, both vertically and horizontally, meaning you add breadcrumbs, for example, to your products, your collections, and you interlink between collections as well. So I think the adding content and internal links, and as Nida said, all of that together would add value and boost those rankings. So.
Awesome, thanks. Actually, while we're on that topic, we got a question from the crowd referring to the facts. Is it better to collapse those or open those, Andrew? Any preference on that?
My preference would be to have them open. There have been, I'm pretty sure there was an A/B test run by that Search Pilot shared about this, where they found that that this correlated with kind of better organic traffic by actually having the accordion exposed all the time. So that would be, from an SEO perspective, I personally think that is a better way to go. But if you search for, in fact, in general, I would say if you're not familiar with Search Pilot, I would highly recommend reading their A/B tests. They're probably one of the only platforms I know of that run really large scale A/B tests for SEO in a very controlled environment, and there are a lot of great learners that come from that. So I'm pretty sure that was one of their tests that correlated with higher traffic. So
yeah,
great, thank you. So Linda, what are some of the most common technical issues you're seeing with Shopify today?
We've touched upon some of them. One of the ones that we see are robots.txt. So that's not easily configurable. You can configure it through Liquid, but it's a plain text file, which seems overly complicated to have to go through Liquid to actually edit this thing. So, it's just always an issue that we see. And it's usually something, for those that don't know, robots.txt file is really important. Gives Google strong hints about what should be crawled and what shouldn't be crawled on a site. And, that, again, it's a TXT file, so it's plain text, should be easily configurable, but we often see that it is something that goes in a backlog of a dev team's, of their backlog, which is not ideal because this is a really important file to Google. It can, really help with crawl budget and other things. That's one. Another thing that we see, images are often not compressed. So we definitely recommend to check that when you set up Shopify. Make sure your images are compressed, that they also have size attributes. We often don't see that being coded. That helps avoid cumulative layout shift, which is one of Google's core web vitals. And then size, obviously, anything you can do to optimize an image, because they're generally larger assets, can help speed up the load. So that's another thing. We've already talked about canonicals, but something that I do see, in addition to the My Shopify issues, is just, and Mag's already mentioned this as well, just the canonicals are not correct out of the box. So, we often see, like, when there are updates of some sort of update that goes out, sometimes the canonicals get wiped out. So always keep your eye on those. One of the other things that I guess I would call out is sub-collections. So a lot of times, you have, especially in the, in any field, right? But I'm just going to use a fashion example. Say you have dresses and you want to create like long dresses, maxi dresses, or mini dresses, or summer dresses, or winter dresses, or whatever. This is difficult to do. You have to create a separate collection, which isn't always ideal, right? Because the larger collection should, in a taxonomy, is usually, has children and it makes logical sense. And then the breadcrumbs can follow from there. So it is a bit of a constraint, just something to be aware of when you set this up. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Mags, any other technical issues that you're seeing on a common basis?
I will actually say from slightly different angle again. And this is not Shopify itself, but the problem is that obviously out of the box themes, they are quite limited on Shopify. And what we see is that lots of webmasters, they just install different apps on Shopify. And, the more apps you have, the slower the website gets. And I think this is some kind of a technical difficult because everyone thinks that, well, there's app for it, but in reality, you have to be really cautious with which apps you actually use, just to be aware of this page load too. So that'll be my answer to this question.
Great, thank you. Andrew, any last thoughts on that one?
I can't think of anything else to add off the top of my head, to be honest.
Fair enough. So Mags, I know a lot of people are, they run blogs in conjunction with their SEO, e-commerce sites. What do you think of Shopify as a blogging platform as well?
I would say, yes, you definitely can do it, but I think you need to take a step back before you start using Shopify as a blogging and answer this question. If your website is a primary focus on blogging and you have, let's say, quite a few digital products or some products which you sell, based on the limitations of blogging on Shopify, I would strongly advise to actually use different platform for this. But if the blog is should complement actually your e-commerce business, I believe that Shopify blog is more than enough. In reality, you need functionality to allow you to publish content, and that's enough really in such a case. So yes, the answer would be yes, you can definitely do it. It has limitations, but at the same time, if this is not your core business, the blogging, then you should go for Shopify in such a case.
Great, thanks. Andrew, anything to add?
Certainly, like kind of Mag sort of mentioned this, but I do. If it were my choice, like when it comes to kind of blogging, I would generally opt for something other than Shopify, just because it will give you more flexibility, right? So probably the most common platform in the world for websites is WordPress. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that you should build a WordPress blog, but certainly it will give you a lot more flexibility when it comes to the kind of plugins that you can install that are kind of most suitable for blogging. But as Mags was saying, like generally, if all you need is kind of something which is a way to publish content that's going to complement your products, and maybe you just kind of build out sort of hub and spoke setup by adding, complementary content, then yeah, Shopify is probably enough. If you want something that's going to be a lot more extensive and give you a lot more flexibility, then maybe WordPress or another CMS is going to be a good way to go. And you could potentially set that up on a subdomain, or however you want to try and configure that to have a separate platform for blogging.
Thanks, Linda. Anything else to add to that?
No, I think that Mags and Andrew covered it pretty well. So.
All righty. Then I guess Andrew, last question I asked you was about the collection pages. Any advice you have for product pages?
Yeah, so I would say in general, probably product pages are probably more important than collections when it comes to trying to generate traffic. Even though maybe collections are sort of more geared towards some of the higher volume terms, I think the volume of products that you can have and then the intent behind the traffic that goes to products is probably better geared to being more transactional. I think there's a lot of things to consider with products. So one, I would say you see a lot of sites that have quite poor descriptions, and the product descriptions themselves are just not meaty enough. They're kind of potentially there could be a lot of duplication there if you've got lots of similar products. So actually spend the time on really improving those product descriptions. Like your product pages should be really kind of selling the features and the benefits of those products. So expanding those descriptions and kind of getting them to add more SEO value is crucial. The other thing I would say is making sure that your images have really good descriptive alt text and that you have lots of images, right? I think that's super helpful for conversion to have more product images, but also it definitely helps for SEO as well. The other thing that I think is crucial is making sure that you've got schema set up properly. So this is not only important for the page themselves, but also if you haven't got merchant feeds set up, then you should set them up. Just because even if you're not going to buy that traffic, you can, it really helps to get free listings appearing in Google Shopping. But it's also for those feeds to kind of work correctly. Google really likes to see that the schema on the pages essentially matches what you're putting in those feeds. So something that I've kind of seen happen before, and actually we saw that this week with a site that was pushing out hydrogen, is that the review schema dropped off as part of that update. So definitely make sure that you've got, probably out of all the schemas, I would say if you've got reviews, marking those up so you can get star ratings in search result is probably the most important out of all the schema that's there. But you should take advantage of product schema and pretty much anything that you can. The more that you can mark up that content in a consistent way, the more it will help Google understand your products and your taxonomy and everything they should really try to understand about what you're selling. And then the other thing I would say about product pages that you often see is that they really, really lack internal linking. So generally what happens is you end up with homepage to collection to product. But what you don't see enough of is interlinking between products. So really, the way you should think about internal links is they're effectively, it's probably the most important way to tell Google how important a page is, right? So if a page has only one internal link, it's kind of, and then you've got, many other pages that have got maybe hundreds of internal links, that's very, very low down the pecking order in terms of Google, what you're saying. You're saying, okay, well, this page is only important enough to link to it once, right? So if that's happening with a lot of your product pages where you've got really low inbound links going to those low internal links going to those pages, then this is a kind of really important opportunity for you to think about other ways that you can link to those. So maybe you're going to have like related products module. Maybe you're going to have kind of customers also like type of module. There's lots of different ways of dressing this up, but ultimately what you should try and do is leverage all the products that you've got and try to internally link those as much as possible. So product page linking a product page rather than just kind of home collections products.
That's great advice. Thank you. Linda, anything further to add to that?
Yeah, those are really good points, Andrew. I would also add, and I think you mentioned this earlier, is to make sure that the hero image on product pages are eager loaded. All of those, we often see like those are lazy loaded. That's problematic. It slows down the load. It forces search engines to kind of load that first, which blocks all the other things from being loaded. And, the user perception for that is not good. Also affects Core Web Vitals. The other thing I would say is, and I think Mags brought this up earlier, touched on breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs are important on product pages too, because they provide a path back to where the user was from if they came from a collections page, for example. And they also help Google pick up those product pages by crawling. So, if you've got a really clean breadcrumb path for all of your products and collections and pages, then that will help Google crawl your site and get, hopefully more visibility and pick those new pages up when you do have new product pages.
Mags, anything further?
I think everything was covered. Maybe I'll only add this interlinking, which Andrew mentioned. If you have selection of products which are very important for you from conversion perspective and you really want to push them, definitely then feature them on the homepage as well. So this is great from Google and obviously from usability perspective too.
Wonderful. Mags, we've mentioned throughout this webinar that duplication is a big issue. How are you advising to prevent or minimize that duplication?
I feel like everything already was covered, but let me try to summarize this in the answer then. Okay, so first of all, when you set up your Shopify store, make sure you have a proper tagging strategy. So as I mentioned previously, lots of websites we work with, they use huge amount of tags for products. This creates massive amount of landing pages, additional pages which have thin content and are not editable or not easily editable. So make sure that you really limited the number of tags you want to use on the site, so to avoid this duplication. So that'd be number one. The second issue, and this is actually more important than the previous one I said, is that we often see, and I mentioned that before, we often see that, and this is, I believe this is default setup of Shopify, that the products featured on the collection pages don't link to canonical version of the URLs. So this is important switch setting change within the theme actually that has to be applied just to make sure that the correct links are that the website points to correct product links from the collection pages. Yes, although those non-canonical version of the URLs point to correct canonicals on those pages point to correct URLs. In reality, it really wastes Google crawl budget, and this is something what we want to avoid from organic perspective, from SEO point of view. So I would say this is the second, and the third, probably duplication, is simply created by the fact that the products are very similar to each other, and they are not optimized. The meta titles, descriptions, and as Andrew said, the content of those pages is not different from each other enough. Or webmasters or merchants create product pages for every product variant. That also happens. This requires quite a lot of analysis and really thorough thinking and discussion with business how to make it right from business perspective, but also from organic point of view. So I would say those three main things causes mostly duplication, and the work should be focused around that.
Andrew, any fourth or fifth points?
I feel like Mags has pretty much touched on this, but I was just going to say color variance is often a sort of source of duplication on Shopify sites. There are different ways to handle this. Some sites don't really expose them, other sites do. So I think it's kind of up to you how you want to handle that in terms of, do you want to have, unique URLs for every single color, or do you, want to sort of just make those accessible to users, but not necessarily to bots? I would say just try to do it in a way where you've got as much unique content as possible. So make sure that you've got unique titles for each of those color variants, unique meta descriptions. Obviously the product description, you can try and vary a bit as well. Important that the imagery is different. So I would say for Google Shopping, I would say the benefit probably of actually keeping them indexable and having distinct URLs probably outweighs the pros probably outweigh the cons. But yeah, just try to do what you can to make them as distinct as possible. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that Linda maybe wants to add.
Linda, anything further?
No, I think it's been covered really well by both Andrew and Max.
Okay, then, as long as we're focused on you, I right now there's Shopify Plus, there's a rainbow of different flavors, but the hot one right now is hydrogen, and now kind of hydrogen 2 sort of thing. Is now the time to consider migrating from maybe Shopify Pro or Shopify Plus to hydrogen, or is any thoughts on that?
Sure. So just to explain what hydrogen is, it's a headless platform, which means that it's decoupled from the CMS. That requires a bit more development and planning, actually quite a bit more development and planning, but the advantages, if configured correctly, are great. In performance, it's known as a very performant platform if configured properly, and that's really good for Google because it's good for users too, and whatever is good for users is good for Google. So I mean, it is like something to consider, but with a caveat that a couple of caveats actually. It is pretty just setting that up is no small task. It needs to be very well thought out. The CMS that you couple with it, that has to be planned out too, and make sure that all of the SEO components are baked in. So yeah, hydrogen has an SEO component, but that's a little bit hairy because it's all JavaScript. Hydrogen is based on React, which is a JavaScript library that's that can be problematic for SEO. So some of the issues we've seen is just the SEO component is where all of the elements in the head that are important for SEO, like canonicals and titles, are kept. So if those aren't rendered in time for Google to pick them up, they will either appear empty or null, or they will default to whatever the default is for that site in the configuration. There's a lot more I could say about it. But yeah, as far as Hydrogen 2 is concerned, that is, so Shopify acquired Remix, and that platform is based on that platform, that Remix. We haven't actually used it yet. We do know that some of our clients are considering migrating at some point. We are kind of eager to see it, but given like the issues that we've seen with hydrogen itself, and one thing I would recommend is making sure that you have some sort of progressive enhancement is probably the best way to go about it. But if you can't do it that way, then graceful degradation, which is making sure that there's a fallback for your users that don't have the most modern browsers and the most modern setups, so that they can experience your site without seeing a blank page or a blank product page or whatever. So lots to consider. Definitely would recommend having an SEO partner before you even consider this, and they can help you, guide you whether or not it's the right choice for you, and if it is, get them in early to help them set up everything for you and test. So.
Excellent. That's pretty much true of any headless system.
True. Any headless thing is very, very fraught with all kinds of things. So
yes. Mags, anything further to add?
No, I think Linda covered this quite well. Just thinking from this rendering perspective, Linda already mentioned that there's lots of challenges, how those pages are rendered, what is actually visible to Google, what is not. And thorough analysis on templates basis is necessary to really understand obstacles during implementations of this platform. So I think, yeah, that'd be it from me. Thank you.
Andrew, anything additionally on hydrogen or migrating between the various Shopify platforms?
No, I feel like it's been really well covered. Yeah, just I don't know if I'm just repeating, but certainly from a rendering perspective is really where we've seen a lot of issues, right? So as Linda sort of mentioned and Mags mentioned too, because it's so dependent on JavaScript, what you may see is if the site doesn't load fast enough, so if Google isn't able to execute the JavaScript fast enough, then you will just end up with lots and lots of pages that effectively look empty and pretty much the same. So making sure that those pages can be rendered properly is absolutely crucial. So I would just say, yeah, it really comes down to making sure you're testing that heavily. And Google Search Console is probably, quite a nice way of getting an idea of that. It's definitely difficult to get an idea of this prior to going live, but once you are live, I highly recommend you look at Google's page renders. So actually test those on every page type frequently and really get an idea of kind of what does the rendered page look like. And then within the HTML that Google renders, make sure you check that things like internal links are actually rendered properly, that they can be followed. That's something we've seen come up before. We're actually working through this with a client at the moment where they've got sub-navigation links that aren't being rendered properly, and that likely is related to a hydrogen issue. So,
super, thanks. That wraps up my questions. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. And if you're in the audience and you have questions, just type them into the Q&A box. First one is, how does Shopify help companies with deep taxonomies get content down into the deeper faceted pages? Mags, you want to take that one first?
I'm still reading. How does help companies with deep taxonomy to get down to the deeper facets? Okay. You mean I work on something. I actually didn't work on that on Shopify a lot, but on Salesforce quite a lot recently. Can someone help me out with Shopify?
Linda, I know you handled one of those.
Yeah, so
thank you.
Yeah, sure. So facets are an interesting thing on Shopify, and there's different ways to implement. But one caveat I would say, if there's 100 SKU limit, there's ways to get around that for Shopify, but it can be a bit of a kludge. So if you've got a site with a ton of products and a huge or a very in-depth taxonomy, you may want to consider another platform, because trying to get around that is always a challenge. But yeah, you can definitely implement facets on your site, and we definitely encourage it. But there's caveats with that as well. I don't think we have time to get into facets on Shopify and everything else, but yeah, it's definitely doable. But for a larger site, you may want to consider another platform.
Andrew, anything further to add on that?
So we've definitely seen some issues with implementing facets on Shopify sites. I think one example, actually, I think the example I'm thinking of was where certain facet, I think part of the configuration was that there were no, if you implement a facet that doesn't have any entries, that can actually cause, am I right in saying this, Linda? It actually caused an issue where the pages then don't render at all. It broke.
Yeah, that's a hydrogen thing. Yeah, we've seen that recently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so be careful about basically creating empty facets. I guess the other thing is as well is just I think the same type of sort of best practice SEO that you are going to apply to your collections pages or products, the same thing applies to facets, right? Try not to go to the point where you end up creating thin pages because you haven't got enough products on those facets. Make sure that they're unique in the sense that, you don't have a bunch of facets which are essentially just displaying the same products as, as the parent collection or other facets. So try, don't just bundle too many products in them and have those facets be similar. I think these are kind of normal sort of best practice SEO that you would apply to them anyway. And then I would also say these are probably pages which aren't going to get much in terms of internal linking. So one nice kind of trick here, which definitely requires a bit of work, but if you've got If you can, on the product pages, try to include them in the breadcrumb if you can. Now, that might be tricky if you've got products that are in multiple facets, but maybe you want to just kind of pick the most important one. That can be a kind of nice, easy way of getting more internal links pointing to those facet pages.
Super. All right, that answers that question. We have another question from the audience. There's a site that doesn't have multiple country domains, but they do use currency conversion and translation on the site. Is there a correct hreflang approach to these, or how would you recommend handling those? Linda, you want to kick that off?
Yeah. So, okay, I'm just seeing this. Multiple country doesn't have multiple. Okay, doesn't have multiple country domains. Okay, so yeah. So if you've got multiple languages, you can definitely, if they're all based in the US, for example, then you can use the US as the region code, and then you will pair that with a language code. So yeah, you can definitely do that, and then have perhaps like the English, US English, if that's what your default is, as the X default. So definitely make sure you check that implementation. We have seen some issues with hreflang. That's not necessarily a Shopify thing, but it's one of the hardest things in SEO to get correct because there's so many gotchas for hreflang. So, but it's doable, definitely doable. And yes, we would definitely recommend hreflang solution for that kind of setup.
Yep. Andrew, you're nodding your head. Anything further to add to that one?
I guess with this, I think it's in what I'm not clear on is whether or not those different kind of currencies and translations actually have separate URLs. So if if the translations have separate URLs, or maybe this is just being done via kind of cookies, in which case Google is not going to eat those cookies and is not actually going to apply to Google. But it depends on the setup. I'd say if you've got unique URLs for these kind of locale and they're on, even if it's on one domain, that's fine. The domain doesn't really matter. But really what matters is if they've got distinct URLs. If there's distinct URLs, then definitely put hreflang in place.
Yeah. Good point, Andrew. Thank you.
One approach I've seen that is sort of a gray area between there is I have seen some sites that approach it by putting in a locale parameter code. Your base URL is the same, but what would your approach be in a case like that?
I think that's fine. That's definitely one way of doing it. It's not necessarily, probably subfolders is a slightly cleaner way of doing it, but there's no reason why Google won't index those URLs with the parameters. I think, again, as long as the pages as long as the content's unique. So, you've got one version for a particular language, try not to, I would say, if you're going to have like French for Canadian, French for users in France, French, Belgium, French, Swiss, it's going to be a challenge to kind of make that unique. That is where sort of hreflang really comes into its own, because you can obviously set it up that way and have those separate URLs, and Google is okay with that being duplicate content, and that's really where hreflang is super beneficial. So I would say, if you're going to have the query strings in the URL to do it, no problem. hreflang probably, I would say, potentially even more important, actually, if you're going to have those query strings.
Excellent. Mags, anything further to add on that?
No, I agree with both. Absolutely the best practice, yeah.
Okay, any further questions? If not, we're getting close to time, so we'll wrap up. Last call for questions, anyone? No, in that case, Andrew, Linda, Mags, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully everyone has learned a lot. If you need to reach anyone, they're accessible via the intrepidonline.com website. Everyone's also we'll be reaching out, we'll be sending out a deck with some of the Q&As from this, as well as just making this video available after. Give me about a day, as I mentioned at the beginning of this. I'm traveling. I'm guest lecturing at USC today. So once I get back in my office, I'll type all this up and get it out to everyone. But again, thank you all so much, and thanks to the audience as well. And have a fantastic day. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.